a new awareness among black people.
This institution is like many other institutions, which means it's a racist institution.
The most unprotected person in America is the black woman.
For a black person to get an education in this country, he's got to have a lot of guts.
Black.
Hello and welcome to Unspoken. I'm your host, Cici, and you are about to enter what I like to call the hashtag Black Safe Space. This is a place where we just come together, have open, candid conversations about the black community. Joining me today is Dr. Jo Shah, who works around performing race and socialization. And we're going to be speaking about some of the impacts that has on the black community. Dr. Jo, thank you so much for joining me.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
So tell me a little bit about the work that you're doing around performing race and kind of what that means.
The ideas have really come from critical theories and cultural studies and sociological sort of paradigms. And the ideas are around how in society we're often placed into certain positions and certain roles. If you kind of broaden this a little bit from a theoretical perspective, there are theorists like Foucault who have argued that, you know, at the very top you have power. So you have, like, for example, the state or the church or a monarchy, and then those powers percolate in different ways through society. So it's sort of taking those ideas and applying them to our everyday, into sort of contemporary contexts. So the idea that we are consciously or unconsciously performing our identities, and that includes race. Because one thing that often doesn't get discussed is the idea of, you know, how race is not biological. It's a social construct. And by those very means, we're actually just performing these ideas of what it is to be white or black, Asian, and henceforth. So that's where those sort of ideas come from, and my work kind of relates to that a great deal.
And what are some of the impacts of performing your race? How does that affect people on a kind of day-to-day basis, would you say?
So I think sometimes, I mean, what's quite easy to do is to break it down in a conscious and a subconscious way. So in a conscious way, for instance, if you're Black British, so you're a young Black British male, you'll be more aware of the barriers and the issues around, say, policing. So you might be more aware that you're more likely to be stopped and searched than, say, your white friend or even your Asian friend. So there are aspects in our society which are supported by statistics and facts and research which confirm that people belonging to particular races and ethnicities are treated differently or lesser. And having that knowledge might make you behave differently. So you might avoid, for example, if you're a young black male, you might avoid certain areas at certain times. You might avoid certain situations where you think that you might be stopped, for no reason by the police. On an unconscious level, it can relate to the opportunities that are available to you. So you, for instance, might think of ways that you might try and fit in better. A term that's thrown around a great deal is assimilation. So you might try and assimilate with ideas of what it is maybe to fit in, and that might involve performing whiteness as you understand it. So you might embrace aspects in your identity which make you less Asian or less black, so that, and you really sort of reinforce that in a way that you'll be able to get the jobs, you'll be able to get into the good schools or the good colleges or the good universities. So it can vary. I think it very much is down to the individual.
So how do we kind of stop doing these actions and readjust our thought process and emancipate our minds when it comes to performing race?
It's incredibly difficult, but not impossible. And it starts with a process of reflexivity. So really just looking at our lives and looking the way in which we're living our lives, and questioning that quite critically. So, you know, why do I even speak the way I do? You know, why do I socialize the way I do? Where do I, you know, how does where I live have an impact on the quality of my life? So trying to think of every aspect of yourself and then thinking, well, how much of that is a given and how much of that is me just accepting or assuming that's how it is. And then beginning to strip away aspects of your life that you think you're uncomfortable with, that you've always been uncomfortable with, and beginning to take charge and reshaping. And that's a very difficult and lengthy process. I mean, that's not something that can happen overnight, but it's what I call a process of desocializing. So it's actually stepping outside of these socialized identities and realigning yourself with something that feels right to you, that is true to you, that's authentic to you as a person, as a human being. And I think that's a good start. I think also aligning yourself with communities and with voices which reflect and represent, you know, your own ethos and your own sense of being, because I think there is strength in numbers.
So what do you think that institutions can do to support individuals who are often in this position?
I think that's a really good but very tough question, because I think that institutions, systems, processes, procedures, I mean, it's all part of this, what I call social theatre. So this idea that we are all performing roles in this kind of invisible social theatre, and we often don't know what roles we're performing, or we're often sort of we're sometimes perpetuating the problems, and sometimes we're questioning and challenging those problems, and sometimes we become part of the main narrative or become part of the counter narrative. And I think what is important is to have an emerging awareness of the issues and see how they affect all of us. I think sometimes there's a danger of certain institutions or individuals positioning themselves as a representation of, a conversation. And I think institutions in particular are quite guilty of this. Universities in particular can be quite guilty of this, where because we are knowledge generators in a way, to take that position of, authority, knowledge authority. And I think actually taking a step back and saying, well, we're all part of the problem. As a university, we're part of the problem, because we are regenerating colonial knowledge, whether we are aware of this or not. Just trying to think of systems off the top of my head here, but if you look at mass media, you could say, well, maybe we're part of the problem, because we're perpetuating stereotypes and very binary ways of looking at individuals in society, and this is causing negative. This causes negative views and negative feelings amongst communities. Similarly, you can look at the kind of literature that we encounter. It's quite or films or theatre. It's very difficult to encounter a vast array of lots of different viewpoints and lots of different worldviews. Quite often we're coming across something quite singular and quite narrow. So I think we all have a responsibility, whether we're an institution, a structure, a system, or an individual, to say that we are all, to some degree, knowingly or unknowingly, part of this problem of socialization.
And you spoke a lot about sort of decolonialization and how that impacts. Talk to me about how, the curriculum is kind of in line with colonialization and some of the effects around that.
Sure. So I think what's been quite interesting for me across over a 15-year teaching career has been obtaining the knowledge, realizing rather that colonial history just isn't taught in schools.
Yeah, not at all.
Not at all, exactly. So unless you might encounter that through an independent research project or something, but there is nothing formal within the curriculum which really provides that knowledge to our young. So what we have as a result is we have a very simplistic and very sometimes quite counterproductive view of immigration, of race, of multiculturalism, and it's often decontextualized, and that's quite problematic in my view. I mean, as a second generation British Asian person myself, I come from a long history of a colonial past, you know, in terms of my ancestors. So I find it quite bizarre that there's that you know, those ancestors, as other black and brown ancestors, have been completely erased from British history, and their contributions to making Britain great have been erased in favour of this very oversimplified narrative, which is, you know, close the immigration gates. There's too many people coming in, and it gets convoluted with the EU narrative, and it becomes very, very messy, and that seems to percolate in the curriculum as well.
And it's almost like we're living in this sort of state of ignorance.
Yes.
And the whole point of education is to kind of deconstruct ignorance, to kind of break that down so that we're knowledgeable. And the fact that, you know, the curriculum is providing an almost message or a propaganda in a way, and it's taking away from, like you said, the contributions that black and brown people have made in this society. And kind of, how do you think that then impacts us as a people? Like, what do you think that does?
I think part of the problem is, I mean, it's a very complex issue. So just quickly picking up the point about, you used the term propaganda. I'm not sure if it's as well thought out and conceived as that. I think it's just a symptom of colonial ideas that have entered our national subconscious. So often we don't even realise. So when policy making is happening around curriculums, we don't even realise that, you know, these are the messages we're giving across. But in terms of your question around what, you know, sort of what to do, I'd say it's a journey that every individual needs to make, in which they, as exhausting as it is, as tiring as it is, and as much as one might feel, why should I have to do this? I think it is important to take the time to re-engage with one's past and one's histories as much as one can. And I know that that's not easy in a lot of communities, but I think it's really important to try and at least find those connections, whether it's you know, I'll give you my example. So, I mean, born here, you know, I like Nirvana as much as I like Tupac, right? That's my diaspora. But at the same time, as I've gone through that identity formation, I've started connecting with music from the subcontinent and music from, and it might not be music from the countries of origins of my parents or my families, but it still speaks to me. So I think embracing worldviews that are beyond the British scope, that help formulate who we are, to counteract these issues. But in terms of on a broader scale, I think there's definitely a need for decolonising the curriculum. It's very important that we do that.
Very important. And in terms of, let's go kind of and explore psychological well-being and how performing race and stereotypes affects the black community and the Asian community as well. Kind of, what are some of the things that you've come across in your research?
So I found some shocking statistics around especially young boys, young black boys, but also young, in the past used to be young Bangladeshi boys, young Pakistani boys in the education system. But there seems to be this strange dynamic which sometimes we become conscious of through research. But it seems to be this strange dynamic where it appears to start with a labelling of bad behaviour in class. Then you'll have the detention. Then you'll have the suspension or the expulsion.
And it just goes on and on and on.
The pupil referral unit, you know. And then, you know, you might have a probationary system getting, you know, sort of frame into that. And then you've got prison, or then you might have mental health. And it seems to be this really uncomfortable trajectory that goes from a young, innocent child going to school, somehow becoming indoctrinated in all these different systems. And the statistics don't lie. You know, the prisons are overpopulated with people of colour. The mental health system is overpopulated, people of colour, pupil referral units. You know, there are some key issues here. So I think that element of socialization needs to be looked at quite carefully, because there is socialization in general can be quite negative, but the socialization of I'd say young people of colour, but particularly young black boys, I think is very, very problematic. And it's something that we all need to become more conscious of and find ways of challenging. And I do believe that, you know, you can change the world one person at a time. I know that sounds so cliche, but I really do believe that. So I think whatever agency or power we have in whatever we do, just using that in a way that might help a broader issue or a broader community or a broader context, I think is a way forward.
And could we argue that potentially these systems are not really designed for people of colour? Because when we look at things like slavery, you know, black people were referred to as cattle, so weren't even seen as humans. So before black people could fight for equality, we're fighting for humanity.
Yeah.
So could you argue that the actual structures that we're living in today's society is still the same systems that perpetuated that narrative for the black community?
Absolutely. I think there are colonial legacies in these systems of that nature. I mean, you know, you've just given a really uncomfortable, horrible example, which is very true, but there's also, you know, the examples of the human zoos, you know, and you're absolutely right. There was this kind of dehumanizing element to colonization, because if you didn't dehumanize, then how could you justify the treatment
exactly,
and the taking over? And I think sometimes it is subconscious in our system. So I think there are, especially in a contemporary context, there are a lot of fantastic people that want to make a genuine difference, and don't even realize that they are subconsciously assisting the perpetuation of the very systems that have oppressed. And I think there is a conscious discussion at the moment that we're having as a nation state around white privilege and around white fragility and these issues, because I think a lot of well-meaning people who are part of these systems, who want to make a genuine difference, don't realize that there are some fundamental things that need to be changed before those types of changes can happen. And part of that change involves giving up one's privilege. And that's not an easy thing to do. If you say to someone who's privileged, you know, give that up, most people wouldn't want to. So there's a conversation to be had around this as well. It's yes, there are legacies there, and change is possible, but for that to happen, privilege needs to be given over and redistributed, almost like a socialist, you know, redistribution of privilege rather than wealth.
Right.
You know.
And in terms of how do we get the black community and the Asian community to feel confident to speak out about these issues? Because I've noticed that there is quite a lot of fear, there's quite a lot of reservation, you know, worried to maybe lose your job, or, you know, concerned that you may be judged or you may be treated differently if you was to speak out about your experience. So kind of how would you encourage, you know, the black and Asian community as well?
I think I think looking to the role models within the communities. So we have some fantastic role models now. You know, I think artists like Akala are inspirational because they're coming from particular communities which have experienced the issues, so to speak, which are talked about in the mainstream, but they've experienced those firsthand. And so he's coming from a position of experience, but he's also coming from a position of knowledge. And I think looking to individuals like that to help strengthen your position. So I think knowledge is power. So I think fundamentally it is about going out there and engaging with ideas, theories, knowledge, and using that to support your own discussions. I don't feel I would have been as confident having this interview today if I wasn't an academic, because I can come here from a position of, you know, those expertise and research. I feel more confident talking to you as a British Asian person as well as an expert in those areas. I think if I was coming to you just as Joe maybe 20 years ago, I think I probably would have been very apprehensive about saying a lot of the things I'm saying right now. So I know it is hard, but knowledge is power. And I think that's very important to keep sort of going forward with that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jo Shah, for coming in and speaking with me today. And if you would like to know more about Dr. Jo Shah's research on performing race, you can check out the links below. Make sure you comment, subscribe, like, and share this video, and we'll see you again soon.